All right, so today we are going to graph quadratics. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up some steps, and I'm going to follow those steps over here with an actual problem. It will be problem 1 on page 549. All right, so I'm going to go through every step, and at the same time I'm going through steps, I'm going to write the steps over here and follow the exact problem that we have right here. Okay, so step 1. Every problem in the quadratic is set up like this. Y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, where you have to identify what a is, what b is, and what c is. So in our problem, step 1, I'm going to say a is 2, b is 4, and c is -6. Because again, a is always beside the x squared, b is always beside the x, and c is always the value that's out there by itself. Okay, now, c has an important property to it as it represents the y-intercept. And what that means is where your parabola is crossing the y-axis, because anytime that you have a squared problem, it's either going to be looking like that or it's going to be looking like this. And that's where it's going to cross the y-axis. So our problem is going to cross the y-axis at -6. Okay, so at -6 I'm going to put a dot, just to kind of remind ourselves, hey, that's where it's crossing the y-axis at. Okay, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take a formula, and the formula is -b over 2a. This is really, really, really important. So make sure you memorize this formula. All right. So that's going to tell us two things. It's going to tell us the axis of symmetry. So if I was going to cut the parabola in half, I cut it straight down the middle, split it into 2 equal parts. That's what the axis of symmetry is. So what you do is you set x equal to whatever number comes out of that. And again, I'm going to show it to you over here. Okay? And then you add the x coordinates of your vertex is the other thing that it shows you. All right, so with our problem, I'm going to do -4, it's -b, and b value is 4, over 2 times a, which is 2. Now, don't just punch this in your calculator like this, because the calculator thinks it's smarter than you. It thinks it's going to divide these, then multiply, but you want it to multiply the bottom first, and then come up with our value. So, our axis of symmetry of our problem, the chainsaw line, the line that cuts it in half, would be x equals -1. And then our x coordinate of our vertex, the vertex being this point right here, the lowest point on a parabola, or this point right here, the highest point, okay, would be -1 something. We don't know what that is yet. We're going to figure that out here in a second. All right? So, step 3. You set up an XY chart. And usually I write my XY charts left to right. I always write them horizontally. I hardly ever write them vertically. It's just easier for me to see this, okay? And whatever number that came out of here, this value here, whatever that came, that goes in the middle of your X spot right here. So that number goes there. That's not a hashtag, that's a number. I expect you to be laughing at my jokes, because they are hilarious. Okay, so I'm going to set up an XY chart. With 5 points. I'm going to take the value that I got here, which is -1. I'm going to plug that in the middle of my XY chart. Then, to find my other x values, I'm going to go to the same distance from -1 on both sides. So if I go up by 1 from -1, that would be 0. If I go up by 2 from -1, that would be +1. And it's all based on the number that you get here. So if this was a 3, this would be a 4, this would be a 5. Then I would go down. So this is going to be -2, this is going to be -3. Okay, so notice how 0 and -2 are the same distance from -1, and 1 and -3 are the same distance from -1. All right, step 4, plug and chug. So I'm going to take each one of these values, I'm going to plug them back into our formula, and I'm going to figure out values. Now here's what's nice about this. Since it's a parabola, these two are symmetrical, which means these two y values will be the same. Same thing here, these two y values will be the same. And then this y value will be different because it's the lowest point of your graph. So if I look at this, I'm going to take 1, and I'm going to plug it back into my problem. You can take -3 into it. Doesn't matter where you start at. So I'm going to take 1, I'm going to plug it back in here. So I'm going to get 2 times 1 squared plus 4 times 1 minus 6. And you can just take this whole thing and plug it in on your calculator all at once. All right, so if I do 2 times 1 squared, that's 2, plus 4 minus 6, that would be 0. So my values here and here are 0. Then I'm going to take 0 and do the same thing. So I'm going to do 2 times 0 squared plus 4 times 0 minus 6. So if I do that, for this problem, that's going to be 0 plus 0 minus 6, so it's going to be -6. And again, since this is symmetrical, they should be the same on both sides. So any point that's 1 away from -1, they're going to give you the same y value back out. Then I'm going to do the same thing for -1, so 2 times -1. Now watch what I'm doing here. I'm putting these in parentheses. So make sure you put them in parentheses. So I've got 2 times -1 squared, so -1 squared is 1. 1 times 2 is 2. 4 times -1 is -4. And then minus 6. So 2 minus 4 is -2. -2 minus 6 is -8. All right? And then step 5, your last step, is you want to graph and label. So I'm going to go back through everything here in a second. Graph. Hopes I can spell graph correctly, doesn't it? So I'm going to go to our graph. I'm going to plot our points. So our points are at -3, 0. So -3, 0. That's that point right there. -2, -6. So -2, -6 would be this point right here. -1, -8. -1, -8. That point right there. 0, -6. Hey, we already had that as our y-intercept. Sweet, works out. 1, 0. 1, 0 is this point right here. And then we connect the dots. And what we create, and this is like a U at the bottom. I know it kind of looks like a V, but it's more of a U. It's a pretty good drawing by me, I must say. So there's your graph. Okay, so let's just go through a couple things about this graph. The things that are going to be asked from you on the test. I'm going to explain that stuff too. First thing that's always going to be asked is what's your y-intercept? Well, you find your y-intercept right here. -6. And again, it's crossing the y-axis at -6. Usually the next thing that you're going to be asked is what is your vertex? So your vertex is always this point right here, and I'll even write it over here. This right here is your vertex. Vertex. Okay, I'll put a little arrow for you. So that is your vertex. That is always the point of where it's crossing or where the lowest point or the highest point. So the lowest point or the highest point, depending on what type of graph you have. A graph that would be pointing down would be if this number right here was negative, if your front number is negative. Graph that's pointing up, your front number is always positive. Okay? So your vertex here is -1, -8. And then the axis of symmetry, the chainsaw line, that makes sense. Our vertex is right here, by the way. Vertex. Axis of symmetry is our chainsaw line, so the line that's going to cut it in half. And that's the line that cuts it in half, and that equation of that line is x equals -1. Yes, you do have to have x equals -1. The other thing is a maximum and minimum value. So a maximum value would be if you took a baseball and you threw it in the air, okay, and it hit a point where gravity caught it and brought it back down to the ground. The maximum spot where it went as far as the y-axis is concerned, that would be maximum. A minimum would be the opposite direction. Now, if I threw a baseball, it'd go out in outer space and never come back to gravity, obviously. But a minimum point, this is what this one's going to have. So it has a lowest point on the graph, and the lowest spot it goes to the graph is -8. And that number, that max or min number, will always be found right here. Max or min. Okay? That value will always be the y coordinate of your vertex. So our problem right here has a minimum value of -8. All right? Please pay attention to what I'm asking for each problem, because that's going to be important. Make sure that you look at all the instructions, because you won't have to graph every single one of these. There will be only certain problems that you have to graph. If you have any questions, hit me up on the discussion on Schoology. I will take a picture of this and post this picture to Schoology also, so you don't have to watch the video every single time to find this picture and find what all these things mean. Okay? Hopefully everything's going well, and I'll see you here in a week.